this camera is super great.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good.
Why do you already know all this stuff?
I'm a lawyer. I don't say how.
Sorry. You have to catch me up on everything.
Just get shopping. We stayed at the really nice Airbnb. It was like really cute. Like we only paid like $60 per night. So we literally got the whole floor. And we had our individual bedroom. So I kind of like my own room. It's even better than that. Like we were like, something.
Okay, let's get started. The attendance sheet is going around with space to check for coffee and dinner. So make sure that you get signed up before you leave. Okay. Now, our speaker today, let's see, class of
93.
93.
Where do you guys born?
Yeah. So she's currently in Nashville. And let's give her a round of applause for coming back to Grinnell. We didn't have even a good weather report,
It's nice though.
but she brought it with her. So,
I don't know
okay,
about that.
take it away,
All right.
Cameo.
Well, thank you guys for being here, even though I know you have to be. I want to talk a little bit, I know that you guys are learning about innovation and leadership and entrepreneurship and all the different ways that you can apply your Grinnell education out in the workforce. And I'm a very proud alum of Grinnell and also feel like I'm in a very weird industry for most Grinnellians. And I love that, and I love sharing how Grinnell got me where I am today and how you can apply a lot of different things you're learning maybe in spaces that you just never thought about, because I certainly did not think I was going to end up in the music business. So I want to talk a little bit about innovation in the music space because it sort of helps you understand how I got where I am on the entrepreneur side in the music space. And we are a terrible business at innovation. So most of the innovations that have happened in the music industry have come from the outside technology of some kind. And then we're usually there to provide the content for whatever the new technologies are. We don't do a lot of innovation within our own industry because a lot of our craft and our art obviously comes from artists and creatives, and they're creating and they're innovating around art and music, not so much on how we run the business. So, these are obviously only the big points, but these are some of the things that have happened in the industry, and you'll notice that, these things all pop up around us. One of the big exceptions really is Sony with the Walkman, when they came out with the Walkman, which if you don't know what it is, hopefully you can Google that. Because Sony happened to be a technology company that then became a record label organization as well, not because it was a record label that was innovating. So it was one of these weird situations where they happened to have multiple parts of the business, but that's why the technology came from Sony, and the record label piece was later on. But as you can see too, the biggest innovations and changes in our industry, and certainly the most disruption, have come in the last 20 years with the complete gutting of our industry by digital technology. And because, again, we're not an innovative industry by trade, we also shudder away from changes. So digital hit this industry really hard because they didn't embrace it. They ran from it, and they ran from the technology and the technologists. And then the technologists built all of these things around it, right? So Spotify and Apple and all of these companies built huge corporations around content that we didn't really have any part of. So we're not an innovative bunch in our group. So I just used the term music industry. It's kind of, we use them interchangeably with music business. And I'll tell you why, because obviously the industry incorporates all of the different businesses within there, right? But most people, when they talk about the music business, they're talking about recorded music. So they're talking about record labels and people that do the distribution and things like that. So these are very crude buckets of sort of how the industry works right now. And the business itself is very different from what the creators do, right? And creators in this sense are really the artists and the songwriters and what they're making with their art, but it's also the organizations that help protect them. There are trade organizations to help with their publishing and to help with their performance royalties and all of the business pieces that go around the creation of music and making that your job. Then there's distribution and marketing, and these two are really the spaces when people talk about the music business that they're mostly talking about, which is distribution, marketing, and sales and streaming on a separate line, sorry. So the distribution and marketing, primarily those are the record labels. There are 3 major labels left. There used to be 5. They've all been consolidated over the years, and now there's 3 major labels. Now, underneath each of those record labels, there are all kinds of what they call imprints. So you may see a bunch of different things under the Sony umbrella, for instance, but there's only one corporate structure for each. And then there are thousands of independent record labels. And now there are tens of thousands of independent artists who don't even work with an independent label that can put music up, right? Because distribution has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. And then there are third-party marketing companies that sort of fall under that. And a lot of time that's you're hiring somebody to help you with social media or to help you put a marketing plan together around your tour launch if your record label isn't doing that. Then there are the platforms themselves. So sales and streaming, this is the other part that really falls under the business when people talk about music business, and it's really in tandem with the record labels. These are the partners that we're dealing with all the time. So these are the streaming partners, the traditional retail partners, and I know that sounds crazy, but they still exist. Downloads, and then primarily streaming. And we'll get into this because now the whole business is streaming, but we've had a very rough go of it, getting into the digital space. And then the piece that I sort of fit into and is really where the finances are at this point is in the management side of things and in the live business for artists. I'll show you some graphs and things. It used to be that artists made quite a bit of money off of their recorded music, and now most artists don't make any money off of their recorded music. It's really about the live performance and merchandise and deals they do with brands. So agents, bookers, tour personnel, these are kind of things. And obviously, like I said, these are really large buckets, so if you guys want to dig deep on anything specific in the industry at all, we can totally do that over coffee or dinner later too. But live, publishing, and recorded music, those are usually the buckets that people are talking about when they talk about the music business. And because our business is people, they tend to use industry and business interchangeably, so that's why you hear me do it. That's also why. So a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are, and this is obviously the most brief history in mankind. 10 years after Edison invented the phonograph, the first phonograph company was created. And the interesting thing about Columbia is that Columbia still to this day is a record label. They're the only ones that are still left from any of the early stuff. But they started by selling phonographs. It was really, at the time, it was about the opera, like the Metropolitan Opera in New York. They were trying to do, to get that out to people who were outside of New York who couldn't visit the Met. And so a lot of the early recordings were of that. And once they started doing that, there really wasn't any change in what the industry looked like until about 1948. That's when the LP came along. And the only reason that the LP was invented was because there was a person at Columbia Records who wanted there to be the ability to put an entire movement of a classical piece on one side of a vinyl. And so that's where the LP came in. So the modern industry, the way we think about the industry now, really started in 1960. In the 40s and 50s and into the early 60s, it was about the changing of where you could see music and how you could interact with music. Obviously, music has been performed and created way longer than any of this, but the actual sort of structure of what our business is now really started then. And it was because you were seeing music performed on television shows, and radio obviously exploded, and all of these things were happening that, again, we didn't do the innovation, but we were there to provide the content that really changed the game for radio in particular and television. And so we think of that as in the 60s, and then when it really shifted into hardcore business was that decade between Elvis and the Beatles. What had been known as recorded music completely changed the landscape for the modern music industry. There was this combination of performances, being songwriters, and being able to sell records that before had always been sort of, it was one thing or another. And Elvis and the Beatles, both from a sales perspective, just completely widened what that was. And because of that, it became a really lucrative business. And when it became very lucrative, we have all these major investors that come influx into the industry and decide that they want to be part of it. They want to bring their money. This is cool. I want to invest in this, including the mafia. And literally not, these are documented cases. There's a really great book, if you can find it, called Stiffed. And it is a story in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, of a couple of guys that wound up getting busted on RICO charges for laundering money through the music industry. Because we have a product that there's no guarantee it's going to work. So you can easily show lots of money going away or coming in. And the mob found it to be a very lucrative business for them, a great way to launder money. So we have this very sort of dark and twisted history there too. And to be completely honest, I'm not sure we ever really got away from that mentality in the industry, the way we set things up. Then the other boom that came for the industry was when technology started to change, right? So we've had iterations of technology that was great for the record labels, right? If you were a consumer and you had your entire catalog on 8-track, when cassettes came along and the players you could hang on your hip and you could walk around with it, everybody had to replace their entire library, of course, on cassettes. So for the record labels, very lucrative. About 8 years later, that's when CDs came around, and everybody did the exact same thing with CDs. And the interesting part was that during the 80s and the 90s, when this was booming and cassettes and CDs were huge money for the record labels and for the artists in making money, their biggest concern was home taping, right? It was piracy. But they didn't learn from that mistake when they went into thinking about digital and the replication of content that was not authorized by the people that own the content, right? So record labels own what they call the master, which is the recording, because they've paid for the artist to go in and make this recording. So they own the recording. And that replication of that recording, it was happening with cassettes and CDs. People were freaked out when you could burn a CD or when you could tape something on cassette. But they didn't learn from those lessons because they were also still making a ton of money. And at the time, nobody was selling, they were selling 45s. You could get 45s that were one song or two songs, but for the most part, the song you liked the best, you had to buy the whole album. You had to buy the whole vinyl or the whole CD or the whole cassette in order to get that one song that you liked. So the industry set itself up for what happened when technology sort of came in the door. But in 2000, that was the height of CDs. It was $21.5 billion business selling recorded music. Napster technically came out in '99, hit its peak in 2000, late 2000. And for the music business that didn't embrace the technology, by 2015, that $21.5 billion was worth $7 billion. So they took a massive cut in their revenue streams by not really embracing the technology. And then now, the interesting thing is, downloads didn't save us, right? So it was the first time that when you had to replicate your library, you didn't buy the new format for everything, once again, right? So when you moved from cassettes to CDs, everybody bought a whole bunch of CDs to replace their libraries. When they went from CD to downloads with iTunes, what happened was they didn't feel the need to replace the entire collection. They would replace the one song that they liked on a CD. And so the industry didn't see that massive replication of funds for the new format. And a lot of it was, again, they set themselves up for it, right? Nobody was pitching to radio to play an entire album. They're pitching one song, and one song is getting played over and over and over, and then you go buy that album, and all you really like is the one song. Well, that's what iTunes did. I mean, iTunes saw that, Steve saw that, and set it up so that you could just buy that one song, and it changed everything. So the dramatic shift in the finances weren't just because of the technology change, it was also because of the way people could consume music, where it could be song by song instead of entire works. And it was a really different way to think about it, and they didn't know what to do. Well, they knew what to do, they just didn't do it. The good news is that streaming for the first time last year has now overtaken physical in revenue. I know it seems crazy that it wasn't until last year, but it's actually the first time that we've seen an uptick in revenue for recorded music since 2000, which is a big deal. So here's a graph that sort of shows you that, right? So if you can't read it very well because it's a really crappy screenshot, vinyl, cassette, CDs, MP3s, ringtones, because that was the thing, and streaming. So at the peak, you can see how much money there was in the business between CDs and cassettes, and it just fell dramatically in a 10-year span. And the industry wasn't really built to handle that. They didn't know what to do. And this is the first time that we're actually seeing an uptick with streaming. So we're excited about that just because the high costs that the industry paid, it affected everybody, including the artists, particularly the songwriters, felt a really big hit on that for the way that they were paid. So the reason I show you all of that history is because of this, right? So this is a conversation about entrepreneurship and innovation and leadership. And this graph is why I'm here and why I have a business. I think at the very core, entrepreneurs are here to solve a problem, right? They see some kind of problem and they want to solve it. And this graphic really underscores the biggest problem that the music industry has been facing for the past 20 years. The revenue used to come from just a very few sources, right? And the biggest one on CDs in 2000, that was all under control of the record label. So you could essentially have one partner in a record label do a bunch of work for you, and it would be very lucrative, and you wouldn't have to do that much, right? And particularly artist teams didn't have to do as much because that one partner could cover 70% of your revenue. So that was pretty good. The problem is that now this doesn't look the same way, right? So the content, which is the piece that is really usually owned by a record label, is now less than half of the revenue streams for an artist, right? So the live shows have increased dramatically, and obviously streaming didn't even exist before. Brands and merchandise is much bigger than it used to be in the past. So being able to align with brands who are also having trouble finding ways to talk to you guys in an advertising space in a way that seems organic and cool, they're now paying money to artists to participate in that and try to be their advertising trade. And these are all businesses that the traditional industry, the record labels, have not participated in the past. So they're not really helpful to an artist and their team if they don't know how to do marketing around a live show or ticketing, right? They in the past, it didn't really matter. You could kind of put it out there and you had your music coming in and you had all the royalties coming in and it wasn't a big deal. And now most of these new revenue streams fall to the artist and the team that they've built around them. So with this is sort of where my little personal story comes in. So I started on this path, which I did not know, at KDIC here at Grinnell. I was a poli-sci major. I was a first-gen college student and left Grinnell with absolutely no network whatsoever because I didn't come from a family that had built a network of any kind professionally. I also had no idea that you could work in the music industry or that there were jobs like this, not a clue. But I had a roommate when I first came to Grinnell, and she wanted to be a DJ. That was like her goal in life. And I had, at the time, because I'm old, 800 CDs that my poor dad like hyped up to Young Her Second. And I had this huge collection of CDs. And so she wanted to be a DJ, and I had all this music. And at the time, the shows were really competitive for playing the like current alternative music. That's what everybody wanted to do. So we came up with a show called Music to Solve Your Rubik's Cube, which was all 80s alternative music, because most of my CDs at the time were like 80s alternative, Cure and Depeche Mode. And we started a show, and she hated it after 2 months, and she quit. And I did it the whole time that I was here, and I DJ'd Harris parties, and I loved it. But I had no idea that that could be anything but having fun while I was in college. So when I left here, I was supposed to go to DC. I had a job set up in, I was supposed to go to American University for grad school. I had a job set up with Tom Harkin, who was the senator at the time. And I went to DC and I freaked out. And I came back to Grinnell and I got in a car with my best friend and we moved to Seattle in 1993. And we had no money and I worked at the mall because that's what a poli-sci major does in 1993. And we spent all of our money on shows. I mean, we had nothing. It was really terrible. My parents were very upset with me. But again, never dawned on me that this could be a job. When that changed was when I had to move back home because I owed my roommate $1,000, which for me at that time might as well have been $10 million. I had no idea how I was ever going to pay her back. And I moved back to Joplin, Missouri, which was where home was for me, which was gut-wrenching. I did not want to be in Joplin. And I was looking for a job, and I was trying to find something where I didn't have to get up early and I didn't have to wear pantyhose, because those were really the only criterion I had. And there was an ad for somebody to run the board at a radio station for a Sunday morning church service. And you just had to show up, plug in the board, let the church service run from its live remote, and then unplug the board. That was basically it. And I thought, well, I mean, I ran a board at KDIC. Surely I can figure this out. I gave them one of my KDIC tapes. I have no idea to this day why they hired me based on that, because nobody should have hired me. And that led to many years in radio. So I worked as a radio disc jockey and a morning show host for about 6 years. Did not see that coming. Parents were not excited about that at all. I think sometimes having conversations with parents about creative careers, as Professor Calkins talks about it, is not easy sometimes, and again, first gen for me, so my parents were like, you're supposed to be a lawyer and a doctor, and I was making $3 an hour at the radio station, so they were not excited about that. So I went back to graduate school while I was doing radio, and got my grad school degree in journalism, thinking, okay, well maybe I can combine my poli-sci and my love of music, and I'll write for Rolling Stone, and that was really what was in my head at the time. So I went to the University of Missouri because I had a great program with internship program with Rolling Stone. And it came down to, I got a Rolling Stone internship and I got the morning show slot at the radio station, and I had to choose between the two. And it was sort of this like existential crisis moment for me, and I chose to stay on radio because I really loved it. And I'm grateful now that I did that, but at the time it was very scary. So when things really shifted for me, like I said, I spent about 6 years in radio. Was when I moved to San Francisco to work for Spinner.com. So at the time in 1999, this was one of the very first streaming radio services. So what Pandora is now, Spinner.com was then. but it was also before all of the legislation happened, so we were dealing with, you could listen, it'll make you guys laugh now, but you could listen, but you could only listen for 4 hours a day, and then your account would get shut down because there were all of these limitations around how much music could be streamed and what the revenue streams were and how much advertising we could do. And so there's this whole legislative thing that was happening, which was really awful. But spinner.com was great because I get to take my first taste of technology in the music space. So I moved to San Francisco. I start working for this company. We get bought out by AOL about 3 months into my employment there. And then we go through 7 rounds of layoffs. Because this is in 2000, this is the bubble. This is the .com bubble in San Francisco. And nobody really knew what to do with us. The labels wouldn't talk to us. So it was kind of the best job ever because we would go to the record store and we would buy whatever we wanted and then we would program it into our stations. And one of the things that happened was when I got there, I realized that all of the music was set up like a playlist is now, right? So when you go on Spotify and you create a playlist, it's a list of songs and it plays in that order, or you can shuffle it, right? So those are the only options that we had too. And what we really needed was we needed to say, okay, well I'm doing a 90s alternative station and I need Nirvana to play twice as much as Green Day. And there wasn't any way to do that in the system. So I sat with the engineers and tried to explain to them sort of how radio mentality worked in that. And we wound up working together to kind of create this software package that would allow the programmers to do that. And my biggest nerd achievement is that I have 2 patents for doing that work. But what I didn't realize at the time was that it was about communicating with different groups, right? It was about, they didn't understand how we worked. They were writing beautiful code, I'm sure it was lovely, but it didn't work the way we thought because we were thinking about how a consumer thinks about music and what they need. And what I found is that I was sort of becoming an interpreter between the technology space and the music space. And it was something that wound up serving me really well in my career, but I didn't know that that's what was happening at the time. Then I get a call in early 2005 for this startup called iTunes. And a friend of mine from Radio Days had just started working there. And they needed somebody to come in and program the rock and alternative genres. And what they were looking for at the time, and again, it's kind of hard for you guys because you've always had this, they didn't have any sense of programmers that were really niche-oriented. Right? It was sort of, everything was very broad, it was very radio-centric, and what they really wanted was 80s alternative and 90s alternative and not just alternative. And so it was my KDIC show that wound up getting me my first job in technology, because they saw that I could create a very niche genre playlist and that would work, right? So that's what got me the gig at iTunes. It was a really interesting and fascinating time to be there because Steve Jobs was very hands-on with the iTunes team. It was something that was very important to him because he loves music. He was also completely nuts and would call you and say, why don't we have the catalog for the Herman's Hermits in the store? And you would go scrambling trying to figure out who owns the digital rights for the Herman's Hermits catalog. Are they alive? Can we find anybody? Record labels. So again, this was a moment where Steve talked to all the record labels, and the record labels didn't embrace it. So Steve just took it over, and that's literally what happened. Is he got the rights to do these catalogs, and he put it out there, and it was an amazing time to be there, but also I was really fortunate in that I got to help launch all of the iTunes stores around the world. So I would go spend a month in Australia, and I would spend a month in Japan, and a month in the UK to hire the teams, teach them how we use the technology, and then build out these stores. So it was very Forrest Gump, kind of right place, right time. Then in 2007, I went to a record label, which I swore I would never do. I moved to New York, and I worked for Motown and Republic. And I was the executive vice president of the label group, which sounds really fancy and had zero authority associated with it. But I oversaw mobile, which was a real business at the time, marketing, sales, digital, all of those kinds of things. And I went into this with a very open mind because all of the challenges that we had at iTunes were about the record labels not really understanding how we worked. And I thought, well, maybe if I can fix it from the inside, I can go in and I can help them understand how the technology works and maybe get them better at wanting to participate with the technology instead of just constantly fighting us, which was what we felt. So I was there for 4 years. I was really lucky because at the time that I was there, the first week that I was there, I had to take Amy Winehouse out to Lollapalooza and make sure that she showed up for all of her interviews with all of the partners, which was not an easy task. The bulk of my job was cash money because it was during the Carter 3 period. So I would get phone calls every single day from Baby calling me, and it would start every morning, "Yo, Baby, it's Baby." He would start laughing. Half the time he would forget why he called, but every day for 4 years, that was the start of my day. It was a really fun time to be there, and working with Wayne and Drake and Nikki when she was starting, and couldn't be more polar opposite to the Amy Winehouse and Jack Johnson and Colby Calais stuff that I was working on, but it was really fun. But I also learned a lot about how the labels operate and how they think. And in a lot of ways, for me personally, it was that they were kind of in conflict with what was right for the artist. It was really about, they've become such big corporations now that it's about their shareholders, right, as any big corporation would be. And that was hard because what I realized was, along the way, because somewhere around Apple was when my parents were finally okay that this was a real job and I was going to not have to live on their couch forever, is that I loved this, and I loved what I did, and I loved music, and the idea that I could help an artist fulfill their dreams as my job was the most amazing thing I could think of. So that was important to me, and when I was at the label, I didn't feel like I was able to do that. I felt like I was learning a lot, but I wasn't helping artists the way that I wanted to, so I knew that the next step for me was going to be management. So I went to a management company in Nashville in 2011. I know nothing about country music. It's not my personal thing. I don't have anything against it, but it just wasn't my cup of tea. So I go to Nashville, and Mormon Entertainment's biggest clients at the time were Keith Urban and Lady Antebellum. So I'm walking right into massive artists in the country space and trying to figure out how to work with that, coming straight from Cash Money into Keith Urban. But the thing that I found really interesting was there was a lot of parody about how you talk to the fans. The hip hop community at the time was very polarized. It was sort of like at the time it was like you're either Cash Money or you're not. And in country it was the same thing. It was like this deep, deep loyalty to these artists in a way that was kind of similar from an audience perspective of how to talk to them. So I came at it from how do I best help Keith Urban? What can I do that will help Keith? What are the things that I can be thinking about from all these other things that I've learned? And what I didn't realize along the way, until I started getting really bored at the management company, was that in my head, entrepreneurship is about starting a business. I thought that was the only thing that was entrepreneurial. So I never once thought about being entrepreneurial in any way. But what I realized was all of these jobs on the board from 99 on didn't exist before I took them. The industry shifted, technology shifted. These weren't jobs that even existed the year before. So I was being more entrepreneurial than I knew because I was walking into gigs that didn't have any structure and I didn't know what they were, and I was kind of figuring out what I was good at and what I wanted to do. And what I realized when I was finishing up at Gorman was all of these things gave me a really broad view of the industry. So instead of having one focused path, I knew about radio, I knew about record labels, I knew about marketing, I knew about streaming, and I knew about artist management. So this is where all of this kind of comes together for me, which is that last year, I started my own company. So what I saw was, from those graphs earlier, is that the managers are the one partner truly aligned with an artist. The managers are the partner for them that have a view of every single thing the artist is doing, every single revenue stream, right? Like record labels are only focused on the recorded music, and agents are only focused on the live show. But the managers are literally managing all of that. So for me, I thought, okay, what can I bring to a manager that would be helpful? And I thought, well, I know all these other places pretty well. I mean, I know how the DSPs, the digital service providers, the iTunes and Spotify and YouTube, I know how they all work. I understand marketing. I know what the labels can and can't do. So maybe that's the thing, is I'm realizing that there's this huge shift in what managers now have to control and pick up, and I want to solve that problem. So the company that I started, in theory, last year is management services. And it's a really broad term, which Elijah can tell you because he externed with me last year and you get a taste of everything. We fill the gaps for managers. So whether that gap is that they don't know how to do tour marketing, or they don't know how to put an album plan together because they don't have a record label or they don't want a record label, whether they don't understand how to do email marketing properly, whatever those things are, we provide expertise for it. So my company has a whole bunch of very senior experts in specific areas that wouldn't make sense for any one manager to hire, but across the board, across many managers, it actually works really well. And so that's what we built, but again, until I took the leap and started that last year, I had no idea. If you had asked me when I left Grinnell if I was going to start a business ever in my lifetime, I would have said no. Nor did I think that KDIC was going to be the thing again that got me where I am, but it was. And it's been amazing to sort of see how you can solve a problem. And when you're in an industry that changes all the time, meaning the art changes, and frankly, we're marketing human beings, which is very challenging because if you're marketing computers, that computer is not going to wake up tomorrow, have a drug overdose, pick up a hooker, like it's not going to do any of those things. We have all of those things to deal with when we're dealing with people, right? That computer, you might have a bum series of those computers, you're not going to have them like fall off the map completely because they wrote a really crappy album and you now have to figure out how to connect the dots for fans, right? It's a very weird and subjective industry to be in, but I learned a lot along the way about leading and innovating that I didn't know that I was doing. So the most important thing to me, and the biggest piece of advice that I can give you guys, is to keep an open mind, right? It's an easy thing to say, but you have to sort of be willing to have those weird things come in the door and say, iTunes, I don't know what that is, but sure, I'll do it. I'll sign up for that. I'll do that thing. If you can keep an open mind, there are opportunities that will come to you or that you'll be open to in ways that you won't if you're super focused on one thing. Now, that doesn't mean that if you want to be a lawyer, don't be a lawyer. If you have a path and it's working and it's what you want to do and you have a passion, great. I can tell you that I did not know what I wanted to do until I grew up, until I was 45, because that's when I started the business. The other thing is, when like I said, when I walked out of here, I had a degree, but I had no professional network. I had no experience. I had no means of figuring out what all of these jobs are. Nor did I think this was a very Grinnellian thing to do. This didn't seem intellectual. It didn't seem challenging. It was a whole bunch of weird things that, to this day, I sometimes struggle with how intellectually stimulating it is. But I didn't know what I was going to do. And I will be the first to tell you that that is okay. You are not your major first and foremost. So whatever you walk out of here with, there are ways that you can apply it everywhere you go. I know that I can talk and write my way out of any situation that I wind up in. You have to embrace your failure. It never feels good in the moment, but I learned way more from failures than I ever did from being successful at anything, because it challenges you. You learn who you are as an employee, you learn who you are as a leader, even if you don't think of yourself in that role, and you figure out whether you have the ability to dust off and pick up or change direction, or identify your own faults and go, I'm not good at this, and I need to do something else. Ask questions. This is my biggest pet peeve in life in general, definitely in my industry. My industry is so much about ego and pretense and the visuals of everything. Nobody wants to look stupid, so nobody asks questions. And it drives me crazy because you can't continue learning if you don't ask questions, right? I'm standing up here, I'm 47 years old, and I work in the music industry. If I did not have externs, interns, employees, consultants that were younger than me, oh my God, it would be terrible. I'm not the person that I'm marketing to on a regular basis, right? You guys are. I want to know what you guys want to do and want to see. So in order to do that, you have to be able to know what you're not good at. And a lot of that winds up being leadership, right? So leadership starts for you guys right now. I can't stress how important it is that everyone that you're in school with now are your peers in the workplace when you get out there, right? So A, don't be an asshole to people that you're peers with right now. But it's really important that you think about teams, and the teams can be a 2-person team that you're going to do a study group with, or it can be the larger teams when you get out into the workplace. But it is really important to learn from each other, and that's where leadership comes from. Leadership comes from listening to other people, being open to what they have to say, even if you completely disagree, and trying things that you don't think are going to work or that you don't think are right. That's how leaders are born, right? I think that leaders versus kind of a dictatorship, you wind up rising out of that. It's really hard, and you guys are gonna run up against this, but there was something that I learned about in this industry, and I had never heard of it, and you guys may be very familiar with it because you're much more savvy than I am. But it's a principle, the Peter Principle is what it's called, and in the music industry, it's rampant. It's rampant in all of corporate America, and you guys are going to come across this at some point. But the thing what I learned about the Peter Principle was, it's basically about failing up, right? So it's that you started a business at a low level, and everybody likes you, so they move you up to the next level. And basically you wind up rising to the level of your incompetence, right? Where you don't have any skill set to do the job at the top, and you're running things. I promise you the entire music business, the entire industry is run by people that were probably really good interns or really great admins and are now presidents of companies, and they don't necessarily have a skill set to run human beings or anything. And the reason I bring this up is because I don't think people think of the music industry for jobs in general. Definitely don't think of it as a mentally stimulating kind of thing. And I want to change that. I want there to be more smart people in this industry, more smart people that want to connect the dots and help this business move forward. I think that the only way that people find out that there's an industry that you can get into usually is because they're a performer and they're interested in performing, and that doesn't really work out for them, so they wind up going, oh, there are all these other jobs here that I didn't know that you could do. And it's important to me that smart people get in the industry, so please think about it. And then finally, pay it forward, which is a very glib, cliche thing to say. But because all those jobs that I didn't exist before I had them, people were taking a risk on me every time they hired me to do those things. There was no guarantee that I was going to work out because nobody knew what the blueprint was for the job. So every time I did one of those jobs, it was super important to me that I think about how I could open the door for other people. It started with me calling Grinnell years and years ago, trying to offer up that this was a weird industry. It's all about who you know, and that if you don't know anybody, it's hard to get into, and I was here to be the first call you could make to at least have that conversation. I can't promise anything, but I can do that. I didn't know that these were real jobs for real people, and every industry that you guys probably hear about from every alum, that's the case. Until you get in it, you don't know how many thousands of weird jobs there are out there that you just don't know about, right? Our worlds are shaped by the people around us, and if you're not around people that are doing these weird things, then you have no way of knowing what these weird jobs are. But it is a relationship industry, and I will tell you, and hopefully Elijah would back me up on this, that my company does externships, we do internships. I am available for advice, phone calls, questions, because I believe that you have to pay it forward. I believe that you have to continue to give back to everyone, and hopefully, as one of the sort of tenets of Grinnell, you guys feel like that in whatever it is that you do when you get out of here. And to that end, too, if you guys don't already know, on Friday, Grinnell Link is happening. I know it probably sounds super lame, but there's a bunch of alums who are here for the weekend. They're volunteers for the college who have a lot of different kinds of experiences and backgrounds and jobs, and you can go talk to them, and they love talking to students. So consider it. Plus there's food. That's the most important thing, is free food. So that's it. That's what I have. Do you guys have questions, or me rambling on and on? Nothing?
But I guess you were saying, like, you want more intellectuals in, like, the music industry. Like, in what capacity would they, like, work?
I think it can work in any capacity. Particularly in probably the business and the marketing pieces. Because I think we're so baseline. We go at the lowest common denominator on things, right? It's no different than marketing porn or marketing like alcohol. It's just, what's that baseline thing how do we get attention for it? And I think that there's room for that to be a little bit more intelligent in how we go at things, even just from a money perspective. I mean, you wouldn't believe how much money is spent on things that make no sense at all. You know, that poster around with my face on it, that was a headshot. They did so much photoshopping on that, and I was an executive. Like, who cares about that? And you can imagine what they're doing for artists and teams. And there just needs to be a little more sensibility, I think, put on it. And I think it can work in any capacity. I really do, including artists. Just being smart about their own business. And that's happening a lot more, I think, because you see people that are self-releasing and things, they're having to be more aware and more savvy about their art and their business.
Yeah. So kind of connecting back to something you
Yeah,
said at the
please.
beginning. You said that the music industry is really resistant to innovation, especially technological innovation, but has that changed in the most recent years? Because, I mean, from the chart you showed us at the beginning, the most recent innovation has really, I mean, the mass amount of innovation has really been from the past 10 to 20 years. Wouldn't it make
Oh,
sense
for
the
sure.
music industry to actually kind of get with the trends? And
You would think. I mean, honestly, the biggest problem with that, I'll say that the overarching answer is yes, because there are a lot of people who are young and in the business who are going, this is insane, why are we doing these things? But the problem is that the way that the record labels structured themselves so long ago, they started making rock stars out of the executives, right? So they have a very expensive infrastructure where they've built it off of the back of artists, right? You can have an artist that can't pay their mortgage and the label president has a driver in a Bentley, right? Every day, and that's not an exaggeration. The president at UMG, every day in New York, his Bentley pulled up with his driver and he wasn't making the music, right? So they should be embracing it, but because their infrastructures are so expensive, they're still fighting against it. So Spotify, when Spotify came out, they had kind of learned a lesson from how poorly they handled iTunes in downloads. So when they partnered with Spotify to give them the music and to license the music to them, they asked for massive advances and things like that, access to the catalog, right? So that they could guarantee that there were some funds that were coming in around that. So it's not that they were being innovative in doing the deals with Spotify. They just thought, okay, well, we'll hedge our bets. We'll make sure that we're going to get our money in advance, and then if it works, great. So there's more innovation, but it's still run, by the most part, by the same guys that have been running it for 40 years.
can I ask a quick
Yeah.
question? What's to stop Spotify from just saying, we'll go around you?
Because they have to have the music. Like the industry owns the content. Spotify doesn't exist without content. So they can't go around because they can't get the music, right? And they try in small ways, right? There are ways that they try to undermine what's happening. So they'll allow you to do a direct deal with them to deliver your music just to them, and you don't have to go through any of these systems. But the truth is that the amount of money that the labels put into marketing an artist, like Beyonce, means that Beyonce is never going to put her music through herself. She's always going to be tied to that label. And when you have that, you can't be a successful service if you don't have Beyonce, right? And by Beyonce, I mean the 100 other major acts that are on there too. There have been services that have tried it, but I guarantee you don't know who they are because of that. Because from a consumer standpoint, you don't understand how the labels work, who cares? But when I go on Spotify, I want to hear Beyonce. So if it's missing, you don't understand why. And that's been a problem for even up until last year for Spotify, that continually there are catalogs that are not on streaming, right? Now it's becoming older things, but it was kind of a joke for us at iTunes. We had a list, we called it the hit list, and it was all the artists who refused to give us their catalogs. So at the time, it was the Beatles, it was Led Zeppelin, it was Metallica, it was Bob Seger, Kid Rock, Tool. I mean, it was just, this list of artists. It's whittled down over the years, but there are still artists that don't allow streaming. And the labels control that content, not Spotify, so they can't go around. So they need us. It's a symbiotic relationship, but it's contentious. And that has gotten better. I will say that the relationship has gotten better. So as far as innovation goes, we're still not innovative, but we're at least embracing that. This is clearly where everything's going. Nobody cares about owning files. Everybody just wants access to the music when they want it, how they want it, on whatever device they're using. So it's getting better, but it's weird. It's a very antiquated business. I know it's not rational. That's why we need smart people. Somebody else have a question?
I may have kind of misunderstood what you said, but So let's say an artist doesn't want their stuff on Spotify, but the label like is the one who facilitates if it's on Spotify. Then
Technically speaking, the label can do it whether the artist wants to or not.
oh,
Most labels will not do that because it makes a contentious relationship with the artist.
okay.
But legally, they absolutely can do that. And it was a big issue for Taylor Swift.
Yeah, that's what.
But in her case, her label is also like, it's a grandstanding thing. They wanted to hold the content back, and that wasn't necessarily about Taylor. So in some cases, they're also being used as pawns in this kind of political thing. Whereas with Radiohead has issues with the way their art is consumed. So they don't like that you can't put, I think for Radiohead for a while, they were looking to see if you could just make it so that it was all one file and you couldn't listen to it broken up, because that's how they create. And you know, the services aren't built for that. That's not how they want to service the music. So there are issues between artists and labels because of it, and sometimes artists' relationships are really contentious with their own labels after they get in there. Cool. Well, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them over coffee or dinner or
Well,
whatever.
it's about time for us to be
Cool.
heading down for coffees. Where's the demo machine?
And if anybody can't make coffee or dinner but wants a business card, I'm happy to leave them too.
No, we're going to,
Okay.
we're going to the dinner.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,